All right, so get ready because today we're going back in time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, back to the Great Depression, a
Yeah.
period that, yeah, still has economists kind of sweating.
Right.
You want to understand what happened.
Yeah.
Well, you specifically asked to look at the role of central bankers.
Those financial titans.
Yeah, those financial titans steering the ship.
Right into the iceberg.
Right into the economic iceberg.
Exactly.
And luckily, we have Liaquat Ahmed's Lords of Finance, the bankers who broke the world, as our guide for this deep dive.
It's interesting, we often picture the Great Depression
as like
this unavoidable catastrophe.
Yeah, like a hurricane.
Like a hurricane.
Yeah.
But what we'll see is that it was the choices these central bankers made.
Right.
Sometimes even their inaction that really fanned the flames.
Okay, so before we get to the crash itself, let's set the scene.
Okay.
Early 1900s.
Right.
London's the financial king of the world.
The center of it all.
Yeah, and the gold standard.
The gold standard.
Is the name of the game.
Right.
So basically, every country's currency is like a photo chip.
Okay.
You can just swap it for a fixed amount of gold.
I see.
This was supposed to keep things stable, but it had some serious downsides.
Yeah, when things went south.
Yeah.
Big time.
Right. Everyone thought this system guaranteed stability.
Right. It created a sense of, global unity, almost like a financial brotherhood. In fact, author Norman Angell argued in his book, The Great Illusion, that war was basically pointless.
Really?
Because everyone's so economically intertwined.
Interesting.
But as we know, that illusion was about to be shattered.
Yeah, and shattered it did in 1914.
With the assassination.
Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Of course.
World War I kicks off.
Kicking off a chain reaction.
Yeah, and throws a massive wrench into the global economy.
Totally.
But here's where it takes interesting.
Okay.
Ahmed paints this picture of Paris in July 1914.
Right before the war.
Right before the war explodes.
Yeah.
And everyone's obsessed with this trial.
Oh, yeah.
Adultery, politics, the works.
Wow.
It's like they're fiddling while Rome burns.
Exactly. And it just highlights how quickly things can unravel.
Right.
And when the war hits, financial markets freak out.
Oh, adapt.
People are running to the banks, just desperately trying to trade their paper money for actual gold.
Oh, so like a run on the banks.
Bank runs in France.
Wow. Panic in the streets.
Yeah.
So what do the governments and the central banks do?
Well, they had to make a tough choice.
Yeah.
They suspended the gold standard.
So basically saying those chips we gave you.
Yeah. Not valid for gold right now.
Not valid right now.
Yeah.
And to fund the war effort, they start printing money like crazy.
Well, it was a necessary evil at the time, but it set the stage for bigger problems down the line.
Right, because it leaves behind
a mountain of debt.
Yeah.
Crippling reparations imposed on Germany. And just this massive task of rebuilding shattered economies.
Yeah. It's a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah.
So stepping into this chaos are our lords of finance.
All right, lay it on me.
We got Montague Norman.
From?
Bank of England.
Okay.
Staunch defender of the gold standard.
Okay.
Benjamin Strong.
Okay.
From the Federal Reserve.
The Fed.
Yeah.
All right.
A pragmatic American trying to manage the Fed's growing global influence.
Got it.
Emile Moreau.
Okay.
From the Banque de France.
Banque de France.
Carrying the spars of war.
Right.
And a bit of a grunge.
Ooh.
And Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, a brilliant but prickly German economist wrestling with those hefty reparations.
It's so interesting how their personalities are as crucial to this story as the economics themselves.
Right.
Norman, for instance, this kind of aristocratic
loose
figure,
yeah.
while Strong's much more hands-on, roll-up-your-sleeves kind of guy.
And their relationships are a tangled web.
Oh, yeah.
Norman and Strong, they form a close bond.
Okay.
But their dealings with Moreau and Schacht are strained, to say the least.
So it's like this high-stakes poker game.
Yeah.
With these four men trying to outmaneuver each other while the world economy teeters on the brink.
Right, and this brings us to the Roaring Twenties.
The Roaring Twenties.
On the surface, it's a time of economic boom.
Especially in the U.S.
Especially in the U.S. The Dawes and Young plans.
Okay.
They ease the pressure on Germany, restructuring their reparation payments.
Okay, I see.
But underneath this shiny facade, troubles brewing.
Yeah, the calm before the storm, right?
So walk us through this. What were the warning signs that everyone seemed to miss during this period of apparent prosperity?
Well, for one thing, excessive lending was fueling a speculative bubble, particularly in the U.S. stock market.
Oh, boy.
Imagine people taking out loans to buy stocks.
To buy stocks.
Hoping to get rich quick.
Oh, no.
And Germany, despite the restructuring, was still deeply in debt, relying on foreign capital just to stay afloat.
Oh, so they were living on borrowed time.
They were living on borrowed time.
Sounds like the Roaring Twenties were more like a financial house of cards.
Yeah.
Ready to collapse at the slightest breeze.
And collapse it did.
With the
1929 stock market crash.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of the panic.
It was like the bottom dropped out of the world.
Yeah.
Banks failed, credit vanished, unemployment skyrocketed.
And remember that interconnectedness we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
Now it works against everyone.
Dragging the whole world down with it.
Okay, so here's where our central bankers really take center stage.
Right.
They're supposed to be the adults in the room.
You would think, right?
You would think so.
The ones to steer us out of this mess.
But they were kind of stuck with the tools of the time.
Exactly. Their hands were tied by the gold standard.
That system where every dollar is linked to a specific amount of gold.
Right.
It was supposed to prevent inflation, but it ended up being a major obstacle in fighting the Depression.
It really did.
I'm still a little fuzzy on that.
Okay.
How did the gold standard actually make things worse?
Okay, so imagine you're a country, right?
Okay.
And your gold reserves are like your emergency savings.
I see.
When people panic and start demanding their money in gold, you have to protect those reserves.
Right.
So you raise interest rates and restrict credit.
So you're making it harder to borrow and spend money.
Exactly.
So instead of giving the economy a jump start, they were slamming on the brakes.
They were.
That seems counterintuitive.
It is. But that was the prevailing wisdom at the time.
Wow.
They were so focused on maintaining the gold standard that they actually ended up making the Depression even deeper.
Oh, Ahmed really highlights this tragic irony, doesn't he?
He does.
These brilliant minds.
Yeah.
Trapped by their own beliefs.
Absolutely. And nowhere is this more evident than in Germany.
Yeah.
The Brüning government, trying to balance the budget, implemented these harsh austerity measures.
Like what?
Cutting unemployment benefits, slashing wages, raising taxes.
You mentioned a hunger chancellor earlier?
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't sound good.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
It created massive social unrest and just deepened the economic crisis.
And ironically, it was shocked.
Right.
Who had resigned from the Reichsbank in protest? Who understood that Germany needed to stimulate its economy?
Or shrink it.
Not shrink it, right?
He even warned that this austerity would pave the way for extremists like Hitler.
Wow, talk about a chilling prediction.
Yeah.
So what was the international response to all this?
Sadly, not much better.
Oh, no.
Remember that tangle of war debts and reparations?
Yeah.
Still hanging over everyone's heads?
Right.
The U.S., now the world's biggest lender, was hesitant to forgive those debts.
They saw Europe,
especially France,
as being fiscally irresponsible.
Yeah.
So everyone was pointing fingers, but no one was willing to take the necessary steps to actually fix things.
Pretty much.
And this is where those personalities we discussed earlier come back into play.
Oh, yeah.
Montague Norman, for example, was deeply distrustful of the French.
Really?
Yeah, he thought they were more interested in punishing Germany than in stabilizing the global economy.
Okay.
Didn't he even refer to them as capricious and a menace to the gold standard?
He did.
In his letters to Benjamin Strong?
Yeah, those private letters and diary entries give us such an amazing glimpse into these behind-the-scenes power struggles that were really shaping global events.
Okay, so we've got a global blame game going on.
Right.
Everyone clinging to the gold standard like a life raft.
Yeah.
Economies spiraling downwards.
Yeah, and then in 1931...
What happens?
Things go from bad to worse.
Uh-oh.
With the credit Anstalt crisis.
The credit Anstalt?
It was Austria's biggest bank.
Okay.
And when it teetered on the brink of collapse, it sent shockwaves through the entire European financial system.
It's like one of those domino displays where one falling brick triggers a chain reaction.
Exactly.
So this is where Norman tries to step in.
Okay.
Tries to orchestrate an international rescue effort. But he's still wedded to the gold standard.
Right, which limits his options.
And the U.S., dealing with its own problems, is reluctant to get involved.
Sadly, yeah.
So the crisis deepens, countries start abandoning the gold standard out of desperation.
Out of desperation, yeah.
Germany imposes capital controls.
Basically, isolating itself from the global financial system.
Wow. And meanwhile, everyday people are bearing the brunt of all this.
Absolutely. Unemployment is reaching unimaginable levels. Businesses are shutting down. Left and right social unrest is on the rise.
Yeah, it's a truly dark chapter in history.
It is.
Made all the more tragic by the fact that so much of it could have been avoided.
Really is.
Okay, so before we jump into the lasting consequences of all this, let's pause and consider what are the biggest takeaways from this period?
Right.
What can we learn from the missteps of these lords of finance?
I think the most important lesson is the danger of clinging to outdated ideas in a rapidly changing world. The gold standard might have seemed like a safe bet in the past, but it became a liability during the Depression.
Sticking with a strategy that's clearly not working.
Yeah.
We've all been there.
We've all been there. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Right.
They needed to adapt to find new tools for a new reality.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another key takeaway.
Okay.
The need for international cooperation.
Right, because in today's world, economies are so intertwined.
They are.
That one country's problems quickly become everyone's problems.
Precisely. And the lack of coordinated action in the 1930s allowed the crisis to spread like wildfire.
Yeah, the distrust between nations,
Right.
the clashing personalities of these central bankers.
It all prevented them from working together towards a solution.
So it sounds like the Great Depression was as much a failure of leadership and cooperation
As it was,
as there was a failure of economic policy.
I think that's a very astute observation.
And it leads us to one final takeaway,
Okay.
which is the importance of learning from history.
Right.
We need to understand the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Couldn't agree more.
That's a powerful reminder.
It is.
So with those lessons in mind, let's shift gears.
Okay.
Explore the lasting legacy of the Great Depression. How did it change the world?
Yeah.
And what echoes of that era can we still see today?
Well, that's a question that deserves its own deep dive.
It does.
And we'll tackle it in the final part of our episode.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Great Depression.
The final leg of our journey.
Yeah, so far we've seen this perfect storm of bad decisions, outdated thinking, and global tensions sending the world spiraling into economic chaos.
Right, a recipe for disaster.
So now it's time to explore the lasting impact of all this.
Okay.
What were the consequences, not just in terms of immediate suffering, but in how we understand and manage economies today?
Yeah, because it wasn't just about lost jobs and shattered dreams, right? It was a seismic shift in global thinking.
Absolutely.
The Great Depression really shattered this idea of, never-ending progress.
Yeah.
That dominated the pre-war era.
Right, the roaring 20s with all its jazz and technological marvels.
Yeah, they created this sense that humanity was on this unstoppable upward trajectory.
It was like a party that got way out of hand.
Uh-huh.
And then everyone woke up with a massive economic hangover.
Exactly. And the Depression really exposed the cracks in the capitalist system, left a lot of people wondering if the whole thing was built on shaky ground.
And politically, things got really messy.
Oh, yeah.
We can't ignore the rise of dangerous ideologies like Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy.
Right.
Those weren't just random events, were they?
No, they were a direct consequence of the economic and social upheaval of the 1930s.
Yeah, when people are desperate and afraid, they're more susceptible to extreme ideas that promise easy solutions.
And those simple solutions, as history shows, often lead to horrifying outcomes.
It's a chilling reminder that economic instability can create fertile ground for all sorts of dangerous ideas.
Absolutely.
So how did the Great Depression change the way we think about economics? Did it lead to any new theories or approaches?
It most certainly did. The experience of the 1930s gave rise to Keynesian economics,
Okay.
named after the British economist John Maynard Keynes.
Okay, so before the Depression, the dominant economic theory was basically let the invisible hand do its thing.
Right. Minimal government intervention, let the market forces of supply and demand regulate themselves.
But Keynes argued that in times of crisis,
Uh-huh.
the government needs to step in and play a more active role.
He did.
So instead of just watching the economy freefall,
Yeah.
what did he say the government should do?
He argued for things like government spending on infrastructure projects to create jobs and using monetary policy to stimulate demand.
So give the economy a boost.
When it was sputtering, yeah.
That sounds like a pretty radical shift
It was.
from the hands-off approach.
From the hands-off approach that was popular before the Depression.
But it had a profound impact on economic policy in the decades that followed.
Absolutely.
Think about the rise of the welfare state social safety nets
Right?
and the focus on maintaining full employment.
Yeah, these ideas were all influenced by the lessons learned from the Great Depression.
It's amazing how this one event reshaped global economic thinking for generations to come.
It really is.
So let's bring things back to the present.
Okay.
Are there any parallels between the 1930s and what we're seeing in the world today?
Well, one obvious parallel is the level of global interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Just like the gold standard linked economies together, back then we live in an era of unprecedented globalization.
Right. What happens in one country can quickly ripple across borders.
It can.
We saw that firsthand with the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, a housing bubble in the U.S. triggered a global recession.
And that highlights another important lesson from the 1930s.
Which is?
The dangers of beggar-thy-neighbor policies.
Right. Back then, countries often tried to solve their own problems by devaluing their currency or raising tariffs, but those actions just made things worse for everyone else.
It's like trying to win a game by making sure everyone else loses.
Right, not a recipe for long-term success.
So in today's interconnected world, we need to find cooperative solutions to economic challenges.
We do.
Protectionism and isolationism will only backfire.
They will.
And what about the role of central banks? What have we learned from the miscapes of those lords of finance? Are we any better equipped to handle economic crises now?
I think we've learned that central banks need to be proactive and flexible.
Yeah.
They can't be afraid to use unconventional tools when necessary.
Right.
The Federal Reserve's response to the 2008 crisis with its quantitative easing programs showed a willingness to adapt that was missing in the 1930s.
So it's not just about having the right tools,
Yeah,
it's about having the courage to use them.
exactly. But we also need to remember that we face new challenges today: climate change, income inequality, geopolitical instability that could trigger economic shocks on a scale we haven't seen before.
So even though we've learned a lot from the Great Depression, there's no room for complacency.
No.
We need to keep learning, adapting, and working together to navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Couldn't agree more. The Great Depression was a pivotal moment in history, and its echoes can still be felt today. By understanding the mistakes and the lessons of that era, we can hopefully build a more resilient and equitable future.
Well said. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive into the Great Depression.
My pleasure.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about understanding the choices that shape our world.
And hopefully learning from those choices so we can make better ones in the future.
Until next time.